Some disappearances are never solved. Some wounds never heal. And some secrets refuse to stay buried. 36 years ago, a mother and her young daughter vanished without a trace after getting into a car. No ransom notes, no messages, no clues. Just silence. A father left behind, drowning in regret, searching for them in every face, every city, every whisper of the past. And now, just when time is running out, a miracle happens. A knock on the door, a face from the past. But the truth is never simple. What really happened that night? Why did they leave? And what secrets have been hidden for decades? Stay with me until the very last second of this story, because nothing is what it seems. Subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I promise, this story will leave you speechless. The night was heavy with rain, droplets slamming against the windows like impatient fingers tapping on glass. Julia sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she held a piece of paper, her eyes fixed on the words that she had written and rewritten too many times to count. Every sentence felt inadequate, every explanation too weak. How do you tell your daughter that the life she has known is built on a lie? How do you say goodbye without saying the words? The air in the small apartment felt suffocating, pressing down on her chest like an invisible weight. The soft sound of a child's breath filled the silence. Sarah was asleep, curled under a thin blanket, her tiny hand resting near her cheek, her lips parted slightly in peaceful oblivion. Julia's heart ached as she watched her, as she always did in the quiet hours before dawn when regret and guilt crept into her mind like unwelcome visitors. She had known this day would come. She had always known. The past had a way of catching up no matter how fast she ran. And now it was here, knocking at her door in the form of a name she hadn't spoken in years, a name she had buried deep. Michael. A crack of thunder shook the walls, and Julia flinched, pressing the note against her chest as if to quiet the frantic beating of her heart. The phone on the nightstand vibrated, the screen illuminating the dark room with an unknown number flashing across it. She stared at it, her body frozen, every instinct screaming not to answer. But she did. She always did. The silence on the other end was deafening. "Julia," a voice finally whispered, rough and tired, filled with something she didn't dare name. "Don't hang up, please." She swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the bed to steady herself. "You shouldn't be calling me," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. "You shouldn't even know where I am." The line crackled and then a sigh. "I never stopped looking." The words sent a shiver down her spine. "Michael," she began, but he cut her off. "Let me see her. Just once. Please." Julia closed her eyes. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, rehearsed every possible response. But now that it was here, she found herself grasping for words that refused to come. "I can't," she finally whispered. "It's too late." There was a long pause, then a quiet, broken laugh. "It's never too late. You know that." But it was. It had been too late the moment she had made the choice to leave, the moment she had climbed into that car with her daughter and never looked back. "She doesn't even know you exist," Julia said, her voice sharp, harsher than she intended. "And that's how it has to stay." The silence stretched, heavy with everything unsaid, everything lost. "You can't keep the truth from her forever," Michael finally said, his voice steadier now, as if he had made peace with something. "She deserves to know." Julia gripped the phone tighter. And what if knowing ruins her? The question hung between them, unanswered. She knew what he would say, what he had always believed, that the truth, no matter how painful, was better than a lie. But he didn't understand. He never had, because he hadn't been the one to pick up the pieces, to wipe away the tears, to hold a child close while she cried in the dark, confused and frightened by things she didn't understand. He hadn't been the one to start over with nothing but a suitcase and a desperate hope that it would be enough. "Goodbye, Michael," she whispered, and before he could respond, she ended the call. Her hands were shaking as she set the phone down, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She turned to look at Sarah, peaceful, unaware of the storm raging just outside the walls of their tiny apartment. She had done everything to protect her, everything, But for the first time in years, doubt crept in. Was she protecting Sarah? Or was she protecting herself? A knock at the door made her jump. Her heart pounded as she stood, every muscle tense. No one came here at this hour. No one was supposed to know where they lived. Slowly, she approached the door, pressing her ear against the wood. Silence. Then another knock, more insistent this time. "Julia?" A voice called softly, and she felt the ground shift beneath her. Not Michael. Someone else. Someone she hadn't heard from in decades. She unlocked the door with trembling hands, and when it swung open, she gasped. "You?" The man standing in the dimly lit hallway gave her a sad smile. "It's been a long time." Julia felt her knees weaken. "How did you find me?" "That doesn't matter," he said gently. "We need to talk." "No," she whispered, stepping back, shaking her head. "Not now. Not after all these years." "You don't have a choice," he said, his expression unreadable. "He's dying, Julia. And if you don't let Sarah see him now, she never will." Her stomach clenched. The walls felt like they were closing in. This was it. The moment she had feared, the moment she had run from. The past had finally caught up with her, and there was nowhere left to hide. Sarah stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly, oblivious to the weight of the decision that loomed over her mother. Julia closed her eyes for a brief moment, then stepped aside, allowing the man to enter. As the door shut behind them, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The past was no longer just a memory. It was here, and it was demanding to be faced. The room felt smaller with him inside it. The past had a way of doing that, shrinking the walls, making it hard to breathe. Julia stood motionless by the door, her hands gripping the fabric of her sweater as if holding herself together. The man, William Carter, watched her with the patience of someone who knew he held all the power in the room. But there was no malice in his gaze, only something that looked like regret. He had aged since the last time she saw him, his hair peppered with gray lines deepening the corners of his eyes. Time had touched them both, but not equally. Julia had spent years running, carrying the weight of every decision on her shoulders, while he had simply been waiting. "You have no right to be here," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. William sighed, rubbing his hand across his jaw. "I know," he admitted, "but I couldn't stay away any longer. Not when I knew what was happening." Julia felt her stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" His eyes softened, and that scared her more than anything. "He doesn't have much time, Julia," he said, and for the first time, she heard the strain in his voice, the effort to hold something back. "Michael is dying." The words crashed into her, but she refused to let them sink in. She shook her head, crossing her arms over her chest as if to shield herself from the impact. "That's not my problem," she said quickly. "That's not." "It is," William interrupted, his tone gentle but unyielding. "Because whether you want to admit it or not, Sarah deserves to know. She deserves the chance to see him before it's too late." Julia let out a sharp breath, turning away from him. The room spun for a moment, memories threatening to claw their way back, memories of a different time, a different Michael. A man who used to hold their daughter in his arms and whisper stories into her ear, who used to leave little notes in Julia's pockets when she wasn't looking, who used to be someone else. But people change. Love changes. And sometimes it isn't enough. She felt William's gaze on her back, waiting. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You don't know what it was like." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Then tell me." She turned to face him, anger flashing in her eyes. "What's the point? None of it matters now. The past is the past." "Is it?" he asked softly. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like it's still controlling your every move." Julia clenched her jaw. She wanted to argue, to push him out the door and pretend this conversation had never happened. But the truth was an unforgiving thing, pressing against the walls of her chest, demanding to be acknowledged. She exhaled slowly, running a hand through her hair. "He wasn't always a bad man," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have to believe that." William nodded, waiting. But somewhere along the way, he stopped being the man I fell in love with, she continued. And I spent years convincing myself that he would come back, that the version of him I knew still existed underneath it all. But he didn't. He never did. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. William took a step closer. "Julia," he said carefully, "was there more to it than you told me?" She felt her breath catch. He was too close to the truth, too close to the part of the story she had never spoken out loud. "I left to protect her," she said instead. "That's all you need to know." William studied her for a long moment, and then his gaze flickered toward the bedroom where Sarah still slept, unaware of the storm raging just outside her door. "What if she wants to know?" he asked. "What if she needs to?" Julia swallowed hard. "She's better off not knowing." William sighed, shaking his head. "You don't believe that." She closed her eyes for a brief moment, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. "I don't have a choice." There was a long silence. Then, finally, William spoke again. "He wrote her a letter." Julia's eyes snapped open. "What?" William pulled an envelope from his coat pocket, the edges slightly worn, the ink faded in places. "He wrote this a long time ago," he said, "but he never had the chance to send it. He asked me to give it to her." Julia stared at it, her pulse quickening. "No," she said quickly. "She doesn't need to see that." "That's not your decision to make," William said, his voice gentle but firm. "She's old enough now, Julia. She deserves the truth." Julia felt the walls closing in again. She had spent so many years building this life, creating a safe world for Sarah, free from the weight of the past. And now, in a single night, it was all unraveling. She shook her head. "I won't let you do this." William sighed. "Then I'll give it to her myself." Panic flared in her chest. "You wouldn't. Try me," he said simply. For a long moment, they stared at each other, the unspoken tension between them thick enough to suffocate. And then, from the other room, a voice broke the silence. "Mom!" Julia's breath hitched. She turned sharply, her heart pounding as she saw Sarah standing in the doorway, her hair tousled from sleep, confusion clouding her features. "Sarah, sweetheart, go back to bed," Julia said quickly, trying to keep her voice steady. But Sarah's eyes moved past her, settling on William. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice laced with curiosity. William hesitated, glancing at Julia before answering. "I'm an old friend of your mother's," he said carefully. Sarah frowned. "Why are you here so late?" Julia opened her mouth to respond, but William beat her to it. "Because there's something you need to know." Julia's stomach dropped. "William," but it was too late. The words were already out there, hanging in the air between them. And for the first time in her life, Julia saw something in Sarah's eyes she had never seen before. Doubt. The walls she had so carefully built were cracking. And for the first time in 36 years, the past was stepping into the light. Sarah stood frozen in the dim glow of the hallway light, her sleep-heavy eyes darting between her mother and the stranger who had somehow made his way into their home. Something felt off. The air was thick with tension, the kind she had never sensed before but now weighed on her chest like a stone. Her mother looked different, her posture stiff, her eyes clouded with something Sarah couldn't quite place. Fear? William Carter held his ground, his expression unreadable as he studied Sarah, as if searching for something familiar in her face. She took a cautious step forward, her bare feet silent against the cold wooden floor. "What do you mean there's something I need to know?" Her voice was quiet but steady. Julia's reaction was immediate. "Nothing," she said quickly, too quickly. "Go back to bed, sweetheart." But Sarah didn't move. "No," she said, and it surprised her how firm her voice sounded. "I want to know." She watched her mother flinch at her words, as if she had been expecting them but still wasn't ready to face them. Julia turned to William, her eyes flashing with unspoken warning. "Don't do this." William exhaled slowly, his gaze heavy with something Sarah didn't understand. "She has a right to know, Julia." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Know what?" Her mother turned back to her, her face pale. "Not now," Julia whispered. And it wasn't a command. It was a plea. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had never seen her mother like this before. Not in all the years they had spent moving from place to place, never staying long enough to plant roots. Julia had always been strong, steady, unshakable. But now, in the presence of this man, she looked fragile, breakable. Sarah's gaze flickered to the envelope in William's hand. "What is that?" For a moment, he hesitated, but then he extended it toward her. "It's from your father," he said softly. Silence. The word hit her like a slap. It didn't make sense. "My father?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt her mother's sharp intake of breath, saw the way her fingers curled into fists at her sides. "Julia," William said, his voice softer now. "She deserves the truth." Sarah turned to her mother, heart pounding. "You told me he died." Julia's face was unreadable, but her silence was an answer in itself. The room tilted. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her, 1,000 questions colliding in her mind all at once. She had spent her entire life believing one thing, that her father had been gone before she ever had the chance to know him. That was the story her mother had told her, and she had never questioned it. Until now. She took a step back. "You lied to me? Sarah, please." Julia's voice was tight with emotion, her hands reaching out as if to catch her before she fell too far into the truth. "It's not that simple." Sarah's throat tightened. "Then explain it to me," she said, her voice trembling. "Make it simple." But Julia said nothing. The silence stretched, suffocating. Sarah turned to William. "Where is he?" A shadow passed over his face. "He's in the hospital," he said carefully. "He's very sick, Sarah. He doesn't have much time." Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. She turned back to her mother. "And you were never going to tell me?" Tears welled in Julia's eyes. "I was trying to protect you." Sarah let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "From what?" "From my own father." Julia flinched. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand." The words echoed in the small apartment, loud and raw. Her mother looked away, blinking back tears. Sarah's hands shook as she looked at the envelope still clutched in William's grasp. Slowly, cautiously, she reached for it, her fingers brushing against the worn edges. Her name was written on the front in faded ink, a name she suddenly wasn't sure belonged to her anymore. For a long moment, she just stared at it. Then, with a deep breath, she slid her thumb under the seal and tore it open. The paper inside was old, the creases worn from years of being handled. Her father's handwriting was uneven, as if his hands had been shaking as he wrote. She swallowed hard and began to read. "Sarah, if you're reading this, it means I never got the chance to tell you in person. And for that, I am so sorry. There are so many things I wish I could say to you, so many things I should have said years ago. But most of all, I need you to know that I never stopped looking for you. Not for a single day. I don't know what your mother has told you, and I won't pretend to know her reasons. But what I do know is this. I loved you. I still do. And I will until my last breath. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to understand. But if you ever want to know the truth, the whole truth, you know where to find me. I'll be waiting. Love, Dad." Sarah's vision blurred as she lowered the letter, her hands trembling. She looked up, meeting her mother's tear-filled eyes. "You kept this from me?" she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "All these years." Julia's face crumpled. "Sarah, But Sarah shook her head. "I don't want to hear it." She turned to William. "Take me to him." Julia took a step forward, panic flashing in her eyes. "No," she said quickly. "You don't understand, Sarah. There are things. I don't care." Sarah's voice broke, and for the first time, she felt the weight of everything she had lost, everything that had been stolen from her. "I have a right to see him, and you don't get to take that away from me." Julia's breath shuddered. "Please," she whispered, "please don't do this." But Sarah had already made up her mind. She turned to William. "When can we leave?" William hesitated, glancing at Julia one last time, then nodded. First thing in the morning. Sarah exhaled shakily, trying to steady herself. Julia stood frozen, her face pale with devastation. And Sarah felt something break inside her. Because for the first time in her life, she didn't know who to trust. And that was the scariest thing of all. The morning light seeped through the thin curtains, casting a pale glow over the quiet apartment. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, the letter still clenched in her hands. Her fingers pressed tightly against the fragile paper, as if she could absorb the words into her skin. The night had been endless, her mind looping over every revelation, every shattered piece of the story she thought she knew. She hadn't slept, and yet exhaustion didn't touch her. In the other room, she could hear the faint rustling of her mother moving around, the careful, hesitant steps of someone trying to keep their presence known but at a distance. Sarah hadn't spoken to her since last night. She couldn't. Every time she replayed the conversation in her head, the anger flared hotter, sharper. You kept this from me. You let me believe he was dead. William was already waiting by the door when Sarah stepped out of the bedroom, her bag slung over her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, understanding in his eyes, as if he knew there was nothing he could say that would make this easier. Julia stood by the small kitchen table, gripping a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her face pale, but she didn't try to stop Sarah again. Maybe she had finally realized she couldn't. Sarah hesitated just for a second. Some small, instinctual part of her wanted her mother to say something, anything to explain, to fix this. But Julia stayed silent, and the moment passed. Without another word, Sarah turned toward the door. Sarah. She stopped, her hand on the doorknob, but didn't turn around. Her mother's voice was hoarse. Please, just be careful. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, willing the lump in her throat to disappear, then walked out without answering. The drive was quiet. William focused on the road, letting the silence settle between them like a thin sheet of ice, fragile, dangerous, ready to crack at the slightest pressure. Sarah stared out the window, the city streets blurring past, unfamiliar yet strangely comforting in their anonymity. She had spent her entire life moving from one town to the next, never staying long enough to form attachments, never questioning why. And now, for the first time, she understood. She had spent her whole life running from a ghost. I remember his voice, she said suddenly, breaking the silence. William glanced at her briefly. Your father's. Sarah nodded. It's faint, but it's there. A memory, I guess. She swallowed hard, gripping her hands together. Did he ever stop looking for us? William sighed. No, not for a single day. She turned to him then, searching his face for signs of dishonesty, but there was nothing but quiet sincerity. He tried everything, William continued. Private investigators searching on his own. He never gave up. Sarah's throat tightened. Then why didn't he find us? William hesitated. Your mother was very careful. She made sure you both stayed hidden. A bitter laugh escaped Sarah's lips. Yeah, I figured that much. They fell into silence again, the weight of unspoken words settling heavily between them. The hospital loomed in the distance, its stark white walls and endless glass windows reflecting the morning sun. The sight of it sent a jolt of something unfamiliar through Sarah. Anticipation, dread, a strange mix of both. William parked and turned to her. Are you ready? No, but she nodded anyway. The sterile scent of disinfectant filled her nostrils as they stepped inside, the beeping of monitors and the distant murmur of hushed voices creating a constant, unsettling hum. The hospital felt like a world suspended in time, where life and death coexisted in a fragile balance. Sarah's fingers curled into fists as they approached the reception desk. William spoke briefly with a nurse, and a moment later, they were being led down a long hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last. And then, suddenly, they were there. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, Sarah could see the outline of a man lying in the bed, his body frail against the white sheets. Her breath caught in her throat. This was it. William placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Take your time." She swallowed hard, then stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the blinds drawn against the harsh daylight. Machines beeped softly, the only indication that time was still moving forward. And in the center of it all was him, her father, Michael Callahan. Sarah froze. The man before her was not the strong, larger-than-life figure she had tried to imagine in her mind. He was thin, his skin pale, his once dark hair streaked with gray. His chest rose and fell with effort, as if even breathing had become a battle. And then, as if sensing her presence, his eyes opened. For a long moment he just stared. And then, "Sarah?" His voice was weak, but it hit her like a tidal wave. Sarah felt something inside her break. "You're really here," he whispered, his eyes shining with something she couldn't quite name. I thought I'd never get the chance to see you again." Her throat was too tight to speak. Michael tried to move, but even the smallest effort seemed to drain him. "Don't," she said quickly, finally finding her voice. Just stay still." A small, weary smile tugged at his lips. "You sound just like her." Sarah swallowed hard. "Like who?" "Your mother." The mention of Julia sent a fresh wave of emotion through her, but she shoved it down. Michael studied her carefully, as if trying to memorize every detail. "You look like her too." Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. Michael let out a small breath. "Then let me say it." His hand trembled as he reached for hers, and after a long hesitation, she let him take it. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything." Sarah's chest ached. She had spent so many years imagining this moment, wondering what she would say if she ever met him. But now that she was here, nothing felt real. There was so much she didn't know, so much she still didn't understand. But one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. Sarah sat in the stiff hospital chair, her fingers nervously twisting together in her lap as the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence between them. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with years of unspoken words, with the weight of a past she had never been given the chance to understand. Michael was watching her, his tired eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. Longing? Regret? Relief? Maybe all of it at once. She wasn't sure what to feel either. There was a part of her that had spent years unknowingly grieving a man she had believed to be dead. And now here he was, breathing, alive, though just barely. The image of him lying in that hospital bed, frail and weak, clashed violently with the father she had tried to construct in her mind. And the reality of it unsettled her. "I don't know where to start," Michael admitted, his voice hoarse, as if speaking took more strength than he had. Sarah exhaled sharply. "You could start by telling me why my mother kept me from you." He flinched slightly at her words, as if they physically pained him, and for a moment, she thought he might refuse to answer. But then, after a long silence, he nodded. "You deserve the truth," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't think it's the truth you've been told." Sarah stiffened. "What does that mean?" Michael sighed, shifting slightly against the pillows. "Your mother left for reasons she believed were right. She thought she was protecting you." Sarah frowned. "Protecting me from what?" "From you." Michael hesitated, something flickering in his eyes. "Not in the way you think." A cold feeling settled in her stomach. "Then explain it to me," she pressed. "Because from where I'm standing, she made sure I grew up thinking my father was dead. And I need to know why." Michael closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to summon the strength to say what had been left unsaid for decades. "When your mother and I first met," he began, his voice distant, "we were kids, barely older than you are now, and we were in love in a way that felt untouchable, like nothing could break us." He let out a small, wistful chuckle. "We were so naive." Sarah swallowed hard, watching the way his face softened with the memory. "We built a life together. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And then you came along, and suddenly, everything felt real, bigger, more important." Sarah's chest ached at the thought of the father she had never known holding her as a baby, of a life she could have had. But love, he said, isn't always enough to keep people together, and sometimes, the things you think are unbreakable can fall apart faster than you ever imagined. Sarah felt frustration bubbling up inside her. You're still not telling me what happened. Michael's tired eyes met hers. Because it's not an easy thing to explain. Try, she challenged. He exhaled slowly. Your mother left because she was afraid. Of what? Michael hesitated, his gaze darkening. Of the truth. Sarah's breath hitched. What truth? He hesitated. Then, that she wasn't just running from me. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. I don't understand, she said slowly. Michael's expression turned pained. Because there are things you don't know, Sarah. Things I wasn't supposed to tell you. Sarah's heart pounded. Then tell me. Michael studied her for a long moment. Then finally, with great effort, he reached for the drawer beside his bed. His hands trembled as he pulled out an old, worn envelope. I wrote you another letter, he said quietly. A long time ago. Sarah's fingers trembled as she took it from him, staring at her own name written in faded ink. I didn't think I'd ever get the chance to give it to you, he admitted. But if you're here, then maybe it's time you finally know everything. Sarah swallowed hard, her heart hammering as she carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the aged paper inside. Her hands shook as she began to read. Sarah, if you're reading this, it means you found me. And if you found me, then I need you to know the truth, the real truth. Not just about me, but about her. Your mother didn't leave because of me. She left because she was running from something else, someone else. And if she never told you, then it means she was still afraid. Sarah, you have a sister. The words blurred before her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. No, this wasn't possible. Her pulse roared in her ears as she read the words again, her mind struggling to make sense of them. A sister? A sister? The paper trembled in her hands as she turned to Michael, her voice barely more than a whisper. What is this? His eyes were filled with sorrow. The truth. Sarah felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. No, she said, shaking her head. That can't be true. But deep down, something inside her whispered that it was. And it changed everything. She sucked in a sharp breath, her chest tightening painfully. I don't, she began, but the words got stuck in her throat. Michael's expression softened. I know this is a lot, he said gently, but I couldn't let you go another day without knowing. Sarah's thoughts were spiraling, crashing into each other like waves in a storm. A sister, a life she never knew existed, a secret her mother had buried so deep that even she hadn't seen it coming. Her breath came faster, her fingers digging into the edges of the letter. Michael's voice pulled her back. She's alive, Sarah. Her head snapped up. What? Michael's lips trembled. Your sister. She's out there. Sarah's heart pounded so hard it hurt. But I don't know where she is, Michael admitted. Your mother took her away just like she took you, and I've spent my whole life trying to find you both. Sarah felt tears burn at the edges of her vision. Why didn't she tell me? She whispered. Michael shook his head. Because the truth would have destroyed everything she built. Sarah let out a shaky breath. A sister. A missing piece of herself that had been kept from her for her entire life. And now she had to find her. Sarah felt like she was drowning. The walls of the hospital room blurred, her pulse roaring in her ears as the letter trembled in her hands. Her eyes darted over the words again, as if rereading them would somehow make them less real. You have a sister. The sentence burned itself into her mind, over and over, until it was all she could think about. Her breath hitched as she turned to Michael, her voice barely holding together. Where is she? Michael's gaze was tired, filled with something that looked like sorrow. I don't know. Sarah's stomach clenched. What do you mean you don't know? Her voice was sharper now, edged with something she didn't recognize. Desperation. Michael exhaled shakily, his fingers twitching against the hospital sheet. Your mother made sure I could never find her, just like she did with you." Sarah's hands curled into fists, frustration rising inside her like a tidal wave. "So all this time, all these years, she's been out there alone?" Michael's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "I don't know if she was alone, but I do know your mother didn't just leave to keep you away from me. She was hiding her, too." Sarah could barely process the words. "Why?" Michael hesitated. "Because your sister wasn't supposed to exist." Silence. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What does that mean?" Michael's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something that sent a chill through her: fear. "I didn't know about her," he admitted, his voice rough. "Not at first. Julia never told me she was pregnant with another child. She never gave me the chance to be her father." Sarah's vision blurred. "She hid her from you too?" Michael nodded, pain flickering across his face. "By the time I found out, it was too late. They were already gone." Sarah's whole body tensed. "But why? Why would she do that?" Michael hesitated, as if he wasn't sure whether to say the words out loud. And then, "Because she didn't think I was the father." The world stopped. Sarah's breath hitched, her pulse pounding so hard she thought she might be sick. "What?" Michael's expression was unreadable. "Your mother. She was keeping a secret, and I think this was it." Sarah's stomach twisted painfully. "So you're saying my sister and I might not even have the same father?" Michael's silence was answer enough. Sarah shot up from her chair, her mind spinning. "This doesn't make sense." She ran a shaking hand through her hair, trying to breathe, trying to think. Michael watched her carefully. "I don't know if it's true. I never got the chance to find out. But what I do know is that Julia was afraid. And whatever she was running from, it wasn't just me." Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her. This changed everything. Her mother had lied. Not just about her father. Not just about their past. But about everything. Sarah turned sharply toward the door. "I have to go." Michael's voice was weak, but urgent. "Sarah." She shook her head, gripping the edge of the chair to steady herself. "I need answers." Michael's expression softened. "Then be careful where you look." Sarah hesitated, something about his tone unsettling. "Why?" Michael exhaled slowly. "Because Julia wasn't just hiding you from me. She was hiding you both from someone else." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "Who?" Michael looked at her for a long moment, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I don't know." But the way he said it told Sarah that, deep down, he had a suspicion. And suddenly, she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The air outside the hospital was crisp, but Sarah barely felt it. Her mind was spinning, her heart pounding as she pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over her mother's number, trembling. She needed to hear it from her. She needed the truth. She hesitated for only a moment before pressing call. The line rang once, twice, and then, "Sarah?" Her mother's voice was soft, hesitant. Sarah gritted her teeth. "Did you think I'd never find out?" A sharp inhale. "Sarah, listen to me." "No," Sarah snapped, her voice shaking. "You don't get to lie to me anymore. I know about her, Mom. I know about my sister." Silence. And then, in the smallest voice, Julia whispered, "Oh God." Sarah clenched her jaw. "You don't get to act surprised. You did this. You kept this from me." "Sarah, please, let me explain." "Then do it," Sarah challenged. "Tell me why you lied. Tell me why you took her away. Tell me why you let me live my whole life thinking I was alone." Julia's voice cracked. "Because I had to." Sarah let out a sharp breath, tears stinging at her eyes. "That's not good enough." "I know," Julia whispered. Sarah's hands trembled. "Where is she?" A long pause. Then, "I don't know." Sarah's blood ran cold. "You don't know?" Julia let out a shaky breath. "I haven't seen her in years." Sarah's chest tightened. "What do you mean? You took her, didn't you?" "I did," Julia admitted. "But she left." Sarah's heart pounded. "She left?" Where did she go? I don't know, Julia repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. She ran away, Sarah, and I've been looking for her ever since. Sarah felt the ground sway beneath her. This wasn't happening. This wasn't real. Her sister wasn't just missing. She was gone. Sarah pressed a hand against her forehead, trying to steady her breath. You're telling me you've spent my whole life hiding her, only to lose her anyway? A quiet sob crackled through the phone. I didn't mean to lose her, Julia whispered. I was trying to keep her safe. Sarah's grip on the phone tightened. Safe from who? Silence. Then, Sarah, her mother said carefully. You need to stop looking. Sarah's stomach clenched. What? Julia's voice was tight, desperate. Please, just come home. Let this go. Sarah's blood ran cold. Why would I do that? Her mother's breath trembled on the other end of the line. Because if you keep searching, you might not like what you find. Sarah's fingers hovered over the phone even after the call ended, her mother's words echoing in her mind. You might not like what you find. A chill ran down her spine. For the first time, she realized this wasn't just about a missing sister. This was about a secret someone had gone to great lengths to keep buried. And whatever it was, Sarah was about to dig it up, no matter the cost. The air outside felt different, heavy, thick with something unspoken, something just out of reach. Sarah stood frozen in the hospital parking lot, her phone still clutched tightly in her hand, her mother's last words ringing in her ears. If you keep searching, you might not like what you find. The warning curled around her like a noose, but it only made her grip on the truth tighten. She wasn't going to stop. She couldn't stop. She had spent her whole life in the dark, moving from city to city without ever questioning why, without realizing she was running from something, running from someone. And now, for the first time, she wasn't running. She was chasing. Her sister was out there, somewhere, and she was going to find her. Sarah forced herself to take a breath, shoving her phone into her pocket as she turned back toward the hospital entrance. There was one person left who might have answers. Michael. When she stepped back into his room, she found him exactly as she had left him, pale, weak, the weight of time pressing down on him like an unbearable force. But his eyes flickered open the moment she entered, as if he had been waiting for her. You talked to her, he murmured, his voice rough. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded slowly. She told me not to look for her. A bitter smile ghosted across Michael's lips. Of course she did. Sarah hesitated, then took a step closer. But that just makes me want to look more. Michael let out a weak chuckle, but there was no amusement in it. Only sadness. You really are my daughter. Sarah clenched her jaw. Tell me what you know. Michael exhaled, his chest rising and falling in slow, labored movements. I know that whatever happened, your mother was willing to burn every bridge to keep it buried. I know she ran without looking back. And I know that whatever scared her enough to disappear. Sarah swallowed. But you don't know who she was running from? Michael's gaze darkened. No, but I have my suspicions. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Tell me. Michael hesitated, as if weighing whether he should say the words out loud. But then, finally, he spoke. She wasn't alone when she left. Sarah's breath caught. You mean? Michael nodded slowly. There was someone else. Someone helping her. Sarah's stomach twisted. Who? Michael's voice was quieter now, barely above a whisper. His name was Daniel Whitmore. The name sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. It didn't sound familiar, but there was something about it, something that felt important. Michael closed his eyes briefly, his face contorting with something that looked like regret. I don't know much about him, only that he showed up right before she left. And then, she was gone. Sarah's hands curled into fists. So you think he had something to do with it? Michael exhaled. I think he was the reason she ran. Sarah's mind spun. If this Daniel Whitmore had been involved, if he had been there when Julia left, then maybe, just maybe, he knew where her sister was. She needed to find him. Michael must have seen the determination in her eyes because he sighed heavily. Sarah. She looked at him sharply. Don't tell me to stop. Michael let out a weak chuckle. I wouldn't dream of it. He paused, studying her carefully. But I will tell you to be careful. Sarah hesitated. Do you think he's dangerous? Michael's gaze darkened. I think anyone who can make Julia disappear for 36 years is someone you don't want to underestimate. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine, but she nodded. I'll be careful. Michael sighed, his exhaustion evident. If you find something, anything, promise me you'll come back before it's too late. Sarah swallowed hard. She knew what he meant. Michael didn't have much time left, and part of her wasn't sure she'd make it back in time. But she nodded anyway. I promise. Michael smiled faintly, his eyes slipping closed again. That's my girl. Sarah watched him for a moment longer, her chest aching, before she turned and left the room. She had work to do. William was waiting for her in the hospital lobby, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. Well? He asked. Sarah exhaled sharply. I need to find someone. William arched a brow. Who? Daniel Whitmore. William frowned. That name doesn't sound familiar. Sarah shook her head. It wouldn't, but Michael said he was there when my mother left. If anyone knows where my sister is, it's him. William hesitated. And you think your mother doesn't want you to find him for a reason? Sarah swallowed hard. I think she's afraid of what I'll find. William studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Then we'd better start looking. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. You're helping me? William sighed. Of course I am. Someone's got to make sure you don't get yourself into trouble. A small, unexpected smile tugged at Sarah's lips. Too late for that. William chuckled. Fair point. Sarah pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking slightly as she typed Daniel Whitmore into the search bar. She held her breath as the results loaded. And then, her blood ran cold, because staring back at her was a missing persons report. Daniel Whitmore had disappeared 3 years ago. Sarah's stomach twisted painfully. Her mother hadn't just been hiding. She had been running from something much, much bigger than Sarah had ever imagined. And whatever it wasn't over yet. Sarah's fingers hovered over the screen, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the missing persons report. Daniel Whitmore, last seen 3 years ago. The details were vague, the kind of report that didn't gain much attention, the kind that faded into the background noise of a world filled with missing people. No known relatives. No confirmed last location. Just gone. A chill ran down her spine. She turned the phone toward William, her voice tight. He disappeared. William frowned, taking the phone from her hands and scanning the report. That can't be a coincidence. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. If my mom was running with him, if she trusted him, and now he's missing, then someone didn't want him to be found. William finished, his voice low. Sarah exhaled sharply, her mind racing. We need to find out what happened to him. If he knew about my sister, if he knew why my mother ran, then he's the missing piece. William studied the screen for another moment, then nodded. Agreed. But where do we start? He has no family, no known last location. If he vanished, he did it cleanly. Sarah clenched her jaw, determination flaring inside her. No one disappears without a trace. She reached for her phone again, her fingers moving quickly as she searched for anything. News articles, forums, mentions of his name in old records. And then, buried in a small local newspaper archive, she found it. A name. A woman named Eleanor Cruz. Sarah's heart pounded. He was last seen in California, and before he disappeared, he was living with someone. A woman. William leaned in, reading over her shoulder. Eleanor Cruz, he murmured. Do you think she knows what happened to him? Sarah swallowed hard. I think she might be the only person left who does. William nodded slowly. Then we need to find her. Sarah didn't hesitate. She tapped on the woman's name, searching through whatever records she could find. There wasn't much, but there was an old business listing. A bookstore, tucked away in a quiet town on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Sarah's fingers tightened around the phone. This is it. This is our next step. William let out a breath. Then let's go. The flight to California was long, but Sarah barely noticed. Her mind was too busy, her thoughts spinning too fast. She stared out the window, her fingers absently tracing the edges of the letter she had taken from Michael's hospital room. She had read it so many times now that the words felt burned into her brain. You have a sister. Somewhere out there, another version of herself existed. Someone with the same blood, the same roots. Someone who had been hidden from her for her entire life. And she had no idea what she would find when she reached the end of this search. But she had to know. William didn't speak much during the flight. He seemed to understand that she needed space, that there were too many things sitting heavy in the air between them. And for that, she was grateful. By the time they landed, the California sky was dark, the city alive with neon lights and the distant hum of traffic. Sarah pulled up the address of the bookstore, her pulse quickening. It's about an hour from here, she murmured. William nodded. Then we should go now. Sarah hesitated. Should we call her first? Let her know we're coming. William shook his head. If she's involved in this, if she knows more than she's saying, she might not want to talk. It's better if we don't give her the chance to disappear. Sarah swallowed hard, then nodded. Let's go. The bookstore was small, nestled between two larger buildings, its exterior worn from time. The neon open sign flickered slightly, casting a faint glow onto the empty sidewalk. Sarah hesitated outside the door, her fingers hovering over the handle. Ready? William asked. No, but she nodded anyway. The bell above the door chimed as they stepped inside, the scent of old paper and ink filling the air. The shop was quiet, the shelves lined with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. And then, a woman emerged from behind the counter. Sarah's breath caught. She was older than Sarah had expected, in her late 50s, maybe early 60s. Her dark hair was streaked with silver, her features sharp, her eyes unreadable as they flickered between Sarah and William. Can I help you? Her voice was calm but guarded. Sarah stepped forward, her pulse hammering. Are you Eleanor Cruz? The woman stiffened slightly, but her expression didn't change. Who's asking? Sarah took a breath. My name is Sarah Callahan. I'm looking for Daniel Whitmore. Something flashed in Eleanor's eyes. Something quick, almost imperceptible. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. She folded her arms across her chest. I don't know anyone by that name. Liar. Sarah's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to stay calm. I think you do. Eleanor held her gaze. Then I think you should leave. Sarah felt her frustration rising, but before she could respond, William stepped forward. Listen, he said, his voice steady, firm. We're not here to cause trouble. We just need answers. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. You should go home, she said quietly. Sarah's jaw clenched. I can't. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. Some things are better left alone. Sarah's heart pounded. Not this. Eleanor sighed, glancing toward the door, as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. And then, finally, she spoke. Daniel's gone, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And if you're smart, you'll stop looking for him. Sarah swallowed hard. What happened to him? Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. He was looking for something, or someone, and then one day he just disappeared. Sarah's stomach nodded. Who was he looking for? Eleanor's eyes met hers. You. The word hit Sarah like a punch to the chest. Her breath caught. What? Eleanor's expression didn't change. He was looking for you, Sarah. And then he vanished. Sarah felt like the room was spinning. Her mind raced. If Daniel Whitmore had been searching for her, if he had been looking for her before he disappeared, then that meant her sister wasn't the only one missing. Someone had been trying to find her. And now someone had made sure he couldn't. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. This wasn't just about the past anymore. This was about the present. And something told her it wasn't over yet. Sarah felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath her feet. The bookstore, the dim lighting, the scent of old paper and dust. All of it faded into the background as Eleanor's words echoed in her mind. He was looking for you, and then he vanished. Her breath caught, her pulse pounding. This wasn't just about her mother anymore. It wasn't just about a missing sister. Someone had been trying to find Sarah. Someone who knew the truth, who had been searching for her long before she even knew she was lost. And now he was gone. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken truths. Eleanor watched her carefully, her sharp gaze unreadable. William shifted beside her, his stance tense, his arms crossed. Sarah swallowed hard, forcing herself to find her voice. Why was he looking for me? Eleanor hesitated, her fingers twitching against the counter. Because he thought he knew where your sister was. Sarah's breath hitched. William stiffened beside her. And did he? Eleanor exhaled slowly. He was close, closer than anyone had ever been. He spent years digging, trying to uncover what your mother had hidden. And then, just when he thought he had the last piece of the puzzle, she trailed off, her gaze darkening. He disappeared, Sarah finished, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor nodded. And no one ever saw him again. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What exactly did he find? Eleanor hesitated again, as if weighing whether to say the words out loud. Then, finally, he found proof that Julia didn't just take your sister away. She paused, her gaze locked onto Sarah's. She gave her to someone. The room spun. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What? Eleanor's expression remained steady. Your mother didn't just run, Sarah. She made a deal. Sarah felt like the walls were closing in. A deal with who? Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. That's the part Daniel never figured out. But whatever it was big enough that she was willing to disappear forever to protect it. Sarah shook her head, disbelief and anger twisting inside her. That doesn't make any sense. Why would she do that? Why would she give her away? Eleanor sighed. I don't know. But Daniel thought he was getting close to finding out. Sarah's stomach clenched. And then he vanished. Eleanor nodded. And now you're walking the same path he did. The warning in her voice was clear, but Sarah didn't care. She wasn't about to stop now. William spoke up, his voice steady. If Daniel was looking for her, if he got close, then there has to be something left behind. Notes, records, something. Eleanor hesitated, then glanced toward the back of the bookstore. There is. Sarah's pulse quickened. Where? Eleanor turned, walking toward a locked door. She pulled out a key from a chain around her neck, hesitating for just a moment before unlocking it. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit back room cluttered with old papers, books stacked haphazardly, a desk covered in faded documents. Sarah stepped inside, her heart pounding. This was his. Eleanor nodded. Everything Daniel found is here. Every lead, every dead end. He spent years trying to figure out what happened to your sister. And now it's yours. Sarah swallowed hard, staring at the mess of papers before her. This was it. The truth was somewhere in here, hidden between the pages, waiting for her to uncover it. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the first stack of papers. William moved beside her, scanning the documents. We need to find something solid, something that connects your mother to whoever she made this deal with. Sarah flipped through the pages, her hands shaking. Old photographs, notes scrawled in the margins of faded newspaper clippings, dates, addresses, names, and then a single sheet of paper that made her blood run cold. It was a birth certificate, but not hers, not her sister's. A different name, Eleanor Whitmore. Sarah's breath caught. Her eyes snapped up to Eleanor, her mind spinning. This is. Eleanor's expression didn't change. Yes. Sarah felt like she couldn't breathe. Your last name, Whitmore. She looked back down at the paper, her vision blurring. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Daniel was my brother. The world tilted. Sarah's heart pounded so hard it hurt. He wasn't just looking for my sister. He was looking for his own. Eleanor nodded. And now you understand why I told you to stop. Sarah's throat tightened. This wasn't just about her family. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. Eleanor studied her carefully. You still have a choice, Sarah. You can walk away from this. You can go back to your life. Leave this buried where it belongs. Sarah clenched her jaw. I can't do that. Eleanor sighed, as if she had expected that answer. Then you need to be ready for what comes next. Sarah's fingers tightened around the paper, because for the first time in her life, she knew exactly what she had to do. And nothing, not even the truth, was going to stop her. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched the birth certificate, the weight of the discovery settling heavily in her chest. Eleanor Whitmore. The pieces of the puzzle were finally fitting together, but instead of relief, all she felt was a deep, unsettling dread. She looked up at Eleanor, her breath uneven. You're her, aren't you? Eleanor's expression didn't change. Yes. Sarah's pulse pounded. You're my sister. The words felt foreign on her tongue, like they didn't belong to her, like they belonged to someone else's story, someone else's life. But they were real. They were the truth. Eleanor exhaled slowly, leaning against the desk as if the weight of it all was pressing down on her, too. I knew this day would come, she murmured. I just didn't know when. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Why didn't you tell me? Eleanor's gaze softened. Would you have believed me? Sarah hesitated. I don't know. A heavy silence stretched between them, filled with all the years lost, all the moments they had been robbed of. Sarah's mind raced. So all this time, you knew about me? Eleanor nodded. Not at first. But when Daniel started looking into your mother, when he found out about you, I realized the truth. Sarah's stomach twisted. And then he disappeared. Eleanor's expression darkened. Yes. Sarah clenched her jaw, her thoughts spiraling. What happened to him? Eleanor shook her head. I don't know. One day he was here, and the next, he was just gone. Sarah felt a deep unease settle in her bones. Someone had wanted to keep the truth buried. Someone had made sure Daniel never found what he was looking for. And now that someone would know Sarah was looking too. William, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward. If Daniel got too close and someone made him disappear, then we need to assume we're in danger too. Sarah swallowed hard, but she nodded. She had come too far to stop now. Eleanor studied her carefully. Are you sure you want to keep going? Sarah met her gaze, steady and unwavering. I need to know everything. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Then there's something you need to see. She turned toward a cabinet in the back of the room, unlocking it with a small key from around her neck. The door creaked open, revealing stacks of old files, records, and photographs. Eleanor pulled out a single, worn folder and handed it to Sarah. This is what Daniel was working on before he disappeared. Sarah's fingers shook as she opened it. The first thing she saw was a photograph, a faded black and white picture of a young woman. Her mother. Sarah's breath caught. But there was someone else in the picture, standing beside her mother. A man. And it wasn't Michael. Sarah's stomach twisted. Who is this? Eleanor hesitated. I don't know his name, but Daniel believed this was the man your mother made a deal with. Sarah's chest tightened. And you think he's the reason she ran? Eleanor nodded. Yes. Sarah's heart pounded. This was it. The final missing piece. If she could figure out who this man was, she could finally understand why her mother had done what she did. But just as she was about to say something, a sound outside made them all freeze. Footsteps. Sarah's breath hitched. William moved first, stepping toward the door, his body tense. Stay here, he whispered, but Sarah grabbed his arm. No, we don't split up. Eleanor was already moving, reaching for something beneath the desk. A small, old revolver. Sarah's stomach churned. Eleanor caught her look. I don't take chances anymore. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. And then, a knock. Slow. Deliberate. No one moved. Sarah's fingers tightened around the file in her hands. Whoever was out there. They knew. They knew she had found the truth. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "We have two choices. We open that door or we run." Sarah swallowed hard. And then, before she could decide, the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, tall, dark hair streaked with gray, a presence that made the air in the room feel suffocating. His gaze landed on Sarah first, and something flickered in his eyes. Recognition. Then, in a voice that sent a shiver down her spine, he spoke. "I was wondering when you'd finally find me." Sarah couldn't breathe, because she knew. She didn't know how, but she did. This was him, the man from the photograph, the man her mother had been running from. And now he had found her.